Put that right over here. Thank you, Rabbi Jacoby and Rabbi Landis. Thank you for hosting me tonight. I'm excited to be here. As you just heard, I do participate with Federation activities right here in this room. So it's wonderful to be able to, after participating in those events, to be able to participate in those same rooms, to be sharing some Divrei Torah here tonight. So I'm really excited for that. Rabbi Jacoby just mentioned those we spend time with, and so did Rabbi Landis. I spend time, as you just heard, with both of them. I want to thank Rabbi Landis for inviting me over here. Rabbi Landis, I can attest, is, despite that football player physique, I suppose it makes quite a contrast with me up here, but he is a sweetheart of a guy. He may be one of those 5 people that I spend my most time with. So I average it out. He and Rabbi Jacoby, wonderful people, wonderful organization. So I want to thank him for inviting me over, and I want to thank you all for attending. I also want to assure you that everything you're going to hear from me tonight, I actually wrote. I'm responsible for that. And I mentioned that because there's this thing, this ChatGPT. I don't know if anybody of you have heard about this. I see some nodding heads. I actually typed in Jewish nostalgia into ChatGPT just to see if it could write something up for me, and it did. And if you're not familiar, that's the new frontier in artificial intelligence, is it's ChatGPT, and that's the type of thing which is going to put all of us out of business, because you can tell that thing to write me a musical, or make me a comedy, or write me a speech, and you could even say make it a Talmudic-based speech at a 4th grade level. You can have all your kids do their homework through that thing. So it's a little scary. It's a new frontier. But I want to assure you that although I did experiment with it, what you're going to hear tonight rests the responsibilities on me and on me alone. So tonight's topic is nostalgia. And when I want to feel nostalgic, and I do, sometimes I'm in that mood. I want to feel nostalgic. And when I do that, I turn on the time machine. What's the time machine? YouTube. YouTube is a time machine. So no better time machine that has yet been invented than YouTube. YouTube is very powerful. It can take you back to places. It can make you nostalgic for times and places that you didn't even live in. That's how powerful a tool YouTube is. And specifically within YouTube is music. People say that there's different senses. People say smell. That when you smell something, it can bring you back to a time and a place. People say that about the smell. I say that about music. When I hear something, when I hear a song in particular, it brings me back to different times and places. So for me, music is what makes me feel nostalgic. And my go-to song, when I want to feel nostalgic, there's a song I listen to. There's a song called The Boys of Summer by Don Henley. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that song. Yeah. That song is everywhere. That was on top of the charts in 1985. The song was absolutely everywhere. It was a smash hit, and you can still hear it today. It's played constantly on radio stations and on videos. It's around. This is Don Henley's Boys of Summer. And this is an achingly beautiful, I don't know how to describe it. It's painful. It's an achingly beautiful song. It's a fast-moving song. It's a rock song. It's not Mozart. But there's something to it. It's hard to put into words, and it gets you right in your gut. And there's a line in there, and I'm going to read the line. And I can actually hear it in my mind. I can hear the music as I'm reading it. I'm not going to sing it, but I'm going to read it, and you can probably hear the music yourself. And he's got a line there. He says, "On the road today, I saw a deadhead sticker on a Cadillac. A little voice inside said, 'Don't look back. You can never look back.'" Okay, so here's this song. In the song, there's a middle-aged guy, and you see the video, you'll see what I mean. It's a middle-aged guy in the video, kind of like myself, and he sees this Grateful Dead sticker, the Deadhead sticker, which is a vestige of the past. It's probably from the mid-'60s or the early '70s, and he wants to go back. This song is in 1985, and he wants to go back to that Deadhead era with the Grateful Dead. But something inside him tells him, that little voice says, "Don't go back. You can never turn back." And that's good advice. Because you can't turn back the clock. You can't go home again, right? Thomas Wolfe? Can't go home again. But the funny thing is if you go on YouTube, YouTube's got this function where you can comment on the YouTube videos. And if you look at these YouTube videos, nobody's listening to what Don Henley is saying. Everybody's out there on these videos, and everybody wants to go back. It's sad, actually. You watch these videos. On that particular video, there's millions of people who have seen it. Don Henley's an interesting guy. He periodically takes down the videos because he feels that nobody should have access to his songs. People should pay for it. So he takes it down, somebody else puts it back up. There's millions of people who are watching it, and they're all commenting, and they all want to be back. They want to be back in the 1980s. They want to be back somewhere else. And it's not just Don Henley. You look at all these videos on YouTube, everybody's commenting. They all want to go back to a different time and a different place. Not just the 80s, although the 80s people really want to go back to. I think that period of time, something special, something magical. But really, it's the 70s, the 90s. People just want to go back in time. So you see, no one's taking Henley's advice. They all want to go back. He's telling them, don't look back. You can never look back. But they all want to go back. So I thought what I want to do there tonight in the short time that we have together is I want to explore, if we can, what the Torah has to say about this topic of nostalgia. You might think the Torah has nothing to say about it. Doesn't seem to be the type of thing that the Torah speaks on, but it does. And the first person in the Torah that we see engaged in nostalgia, I think it may surprise some of us. It surprised me as I began to look into it. The first person that we see in nostalgia is Lot's wife. Lot's wife. You remember the story. Lot's wife, when the angels came to rescue Lot, that's Abraham, Avram Avinu's nephew, the angels came to rescue him from the city of Sodom that was about to be overturned. What did they tell him? The pasuk says, "V'hi kotziam asam hachutza," when the angels were leading them outside, "V'yomer himolet el nafshecha," escape, run for your lives. Al tabid acharecha, don't look back. V'al tamod b'chol hakikar, and don't stop anywhere in the plains. Hehara himalet pentisafeh, run away, run to the hills, literally, otherwise you'll get destroyed. And what does the pasuk say with Ashes Lot, with Lot's wife? The pasuk says, what does the pasuk say? Here, Vatabeit ishto me'acharav, his wife Lot, his wife peered behind him. And she became a pillar of salt. So I think when we're younger, when we hear that story when we're younger, we think, okay, she just peeked behind her. She was told not to look back. She couldn't follow orders. And so she became a pillar of salt. That's really, it's not something we spend a lot of time on, but we hear that story when we're younger, and that's all it means to us, that she just couldn't obey orders. But as I think about it, I don't think that's what the Torah is telling us. I don't think that's what's happening over here. I think when Lot's wife looked back, she was looking back longingly. She was looking back wistfully. Lot knew that he had to get out of there. Lot knew Lot also wanted to stay in Sodom, I assure you. Lot was a very wealthy man in Sodom. He came from, Avram Avinu was a well-known man at those times. Lot had connections. He probably had expensive real estate by the Dead Sea hotels. I don't know. Lot was a wealthy man, but he knew that he had to go. He had to leave everything behind and start a new chapter of his life, which is exactly what he did. He literally went to a cave, but he left behind everything. Lot's wife couldn't do that. So when she looked back, she was looking back longingly. I think what the Torah is trying to say is that she couldn't give it up. She couldn't let go. And that's why she became a pillar of salt. Why a pillar of salt? I once heard a Rebbe in Baltimore explain to me, I went to Ner Israel in Baltimore, just like Rabbi Landis. A Rebbe once explained to me, salt retards growth. It stops growth, right? In ancient times, before we had refrigeration, what did they do if they wanted to stop the decay of meat? They'd pack it with salt, because the salt stopped the bacteria from forming. Same thing, in medieval times, marauding armies, when they'd come, what they would do after they vanquished their foes is they would put salt in the ground to prevent anyone from planting anything in the ground afterwards. Salt stops growth. So Lot's wife, she became a pillar of salt because she was stationary. She couldn't grow. She literally, kipshuto, she became fixated. She became fixated, and that's what I think the Torah is trying to tell us. She was nostalgic at the wrong time. She was nostalgic when she should have been looking forward. So that, I think, is the first place. It's kind of unexpected, I think, but that's really what we see in that episode over there. Lot's wife, nostalgia at the wrong time. She couldn't move forward. She became forever stationary, a pillar of salt. So clearly that's a message to us about the evils of unwarranted nostalgia. But there's more. It's not only that. It was surprising to me as I looked into this, just to see how much the Torah has to say about this topic. The second one, I think, comes in the form of a collective. That's an individual case with Lot's wife. But it also comes collectively a little bit later in Parshas Ba'aloscha. In Parshas Ba'aloscha, we find there's a conflagration breaks out. That's a fancy word for a fire. So a fire breaks out in the camp. It's right after they left Matan Torah, after Har Sinai. They left. The verse tells us that Vatishka ha'esh, that the fire cooled down, which I'm going to take some poetic license to mean that the fire, meaning the zeal, that the excitement that they had for Matan Torah had died down. And so what happens? The pasuk says the people began complaining. What does it say? The pasuk says, Vatishka ha'esh, the pasuk says, Mi yachilenu basar. The people began saying, who's going to give us meat? Zacharnu es hadoga asher nochel b'Mitzrayim. We remember the fish that we had in Egypt, chinam, that we had for free. Es hakishuyim, the cucumbers, ves avatichim, and the watermelons, ves hachatzir, ves habetzolim, ves hashumim, the garlics and the onions. We remember all that. That's where the people started complaining right after Matan Torah. Now, it's incredible. And I really think there can be no more Jewish, this is probably the most Jewish part of the Torah that I can think of. I mean, Rabbi Jacobs was talking about the stories in Bereshis and Exodus, but this is in Numbers. And look how Jewish is this story. They just come out of Egypt. Moshe just took him out, and what happens? They're kvetching, and they're not just kvetching. They don't just remember the food. They remember that they got it for free. They remember they got a good deal on it. Maybe somebody's brother-in-law was in the food business. I don't know. There's nothing more Jewish than this. Zacharnu es hadoga asher nochel b'chinam, and we also got it for free. But if you think about it, it makes no sense. And the whole concept is just, it's mind-boggling. This is what they're complaining about. They're complaining about food that they ate in Egypt. In Egypt, that they were in a state of slavery. They were enslaved people in Egypt, and yet here they are. They're complaining about the food, and they want to go back to the food that they had while they were slaves. And further, the pasuk says they wanted meat. Mi achilenu basar. But then immediately, the pasuk shifts to start to speak about fish. How did fish come into play over here? And what kind of fish are we talking about? This is fish that these slaves people were eating. It wasn't sea bass. This probably wasn't even A and B gefilte fish that they were eating over here. Manischewitz maybe. But what were they eating over here? So it's just remarkable. Again, that shows you, I think, that's the distortion. Nostalgia can give you a distorted image of the past. The past wasn't so glorious when they were in Egypt. They were slaves. And yet here they are looking back just a short period after they left it, and all of a sudden Egypt is starting to look pretty good to them. And by the way, they had the mun at the time. It's not as if they had no food whatsoever. They had the mun, and the pasuk even describes to us what the mun tastes like. The pasuk says it tastes like a donut. Ketzapikas dvash, I think is the lashon of the pasuk. The mun was tasty. It tasted like a donut. And yet, nevertheless, the people were still complaining for the food. So again, I think that's a second example of nostalgia, of misplaced nostalgia. And I think that's important because we see over there how nostalgia can paint an improper and a distorted, is the key word. It's a distorted version of what the past was like. So here with these two stories over here, with the wife of Lot and with the people, the complainers in the desert on the other hand, I think you see two kind of negative impressions. Clearly, I think if you read between the lines, as we must, because we're adults, we're not children anymore, and we have to read the Torah at a more sophisticated level than we were when we were 10 years old. I think if you read the lines over here, you see some sort of a message that the Torah is telling us against nostalgia. As alluring as nostalgia is, the Torah seems to be saying something against it. But it's not a complete picture, because the Torah also tells us, on the other hand, it also places an importance upon memory. And I want to give you an example of that. In Mechias Amalek, there is a mitzvah that comes up every year around March time. That is the mitzvah to remember Amalek. Okay? Everyone from here is familiar with Amalek. Amalek was that nation that attacked the Jewish people. They were the first people that attacked the Jews after they left Egypt. And at that time, the Jewish people, the Israelites, had like this air of invincibility around them. Nobody could attack them. They had all these plagues that occurred in Egypt. Everyone was afraid to come near the Jews. But Amalek was the one that attacked them. And they didn't win. But nevertheless, they shattered that veneer, that image that the Jews had of being invincible. So we are forever commanded to remember Amalek, and we fulfill that mitzvah every year right around Purim time with Parsha Zohar. There's a public reading of the Torah, and we read that one little section of the Torah where it says, Zohar asher asa l'cha Amalek. You have to remember what Amalek did to us. So we have to remember it. So So seemingly, if you look at this, it seems to be a contrast, right? I just brought you down two examples over here where nostalgia seemingly seems to be a bad thing. I didn't tell you also, in that episode in the Midbar in the desert, after the Israelites started fetching about the food, they got a whole new leadership structure. The verses go on to describe that Moshe complains to God. He says, I can't take these people anymore. And all they do is complain. And that's how they got the 70 elders. A whole new leadership structure was put into place. So you have those two stories on the one hand that seem to show that nostalgia is bad, something to watch out for. On the other hand, you have this pasuk over here telling us memory. You've got to keep that memory alive. Zochar es asher asa lecha Amalek. So what's the difference? So the answer is there's a difference. There's a difference between remembering and nostalgia. They're similar, but they're two different things. One is recalling the past. The other is living in the past. The other is longing for the past. When you remember something, you visit. You visit the past for a short period of time, but you don't stay there. You go back for a short period. It's like visiting your parents. You go back for a short period of time, but you don't stay there, hopefully. You don't dwell in it. You don't wish yourself out of the present to live in the past. That's a danger. That's a danger which it's very possible for all of us to succumb to at any time. That's the evils, that's the allure of nostalgia. That's what the Torah warns us against. But remembering the past and looking to the past as a guide, that's something completely different. So until now, we've seen a number of examples from the Torah on this subject. We've seen Lot's wife, we've seen the complainers, and we've seen, on the other hand, the distinction that we make from remembering from Amalek. But I want to look at this topic from a little bit of a different lens also. There's a Gemara, the oral law. The Gemara tells us, this is in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Yud Beis Amud Beis. The Gemara tells us, I'll read it and then I'll translate it. The Gemara says, Im Rishonim ki malachim anu ki bnei adam. Im Rishonim ki bnei adam anu ki chamorim. This is the Gemara. The Gemara is telling us, it's giving us a perspective of how we should look at previous generations. And what the Gemara tells us is, it says, if the earlier ones, meaning the previous generations, if the earlier ones were like angels, then we are like men, regular people. If they were like men, then we are like donkeys. Okay, so once again, if they were like angels, we are like men. If they were like men, then we're like donkeys. So simply, the Gemara seems to be making a generational assessment. And it's saying, frankly, there's no other way to say it, it's saying we're not as good as the previous generations. And it seems to be saying this as if like there's two different proportions over here. There's two ways to look at it. You can look at them as superhuman beings, as angels, then comparatively we're just regular people. If we look at them as regular people, then we're like donkeys. But I once heard, interesting, from the Satmar Rebbe. The Satmar Rebbe says something very interesting. He says that it's not two separate proportions. Really, it's only one. The Gemara is telling us is that if we look at them like angels, then we're like regular human beings. Then we're thinking properly. Then we're thinking normally. But if we look at them like regular human beings, then we're like donkeys. Then we're not seeing things properly. So it's not two separate proportions. It's all one, as how the Satmar Rebbe interpreted that Gemara. Either way, though, regardless whether you go like the Satmar Rebbe or whether you go like the other interpretation, either way, the Gemara is giving us an attitude over here. And the Gemara seems to be saying that we're just not as good as the previous generations. And this attitude, by the way, is not the first time, it's not the only place you find this in the Gemara. If one who learns Talmud in the Gemara will find this attitude all throughout the Talmud. This is a concept called Yeridas Adoros, or Niskatnu Adoros, which refers to the diminishment of the generations. That it's an attitude that seems to suggest that we're just not as good as previous generations, and we're getting worse. And there's a number of Gemaras. I won't get into it tonight. We don't have time. But there are a number of Gemaras that seem to make this same suggestion that we're just not as good as previous generations. The idea seems to be that the further we get from Sinai, the electrical signal, as it were, seems to be getting weaker and weaker, that current. I've actually heard this, I've seen this suggested. The Ran, it's a 14th century Spanish commentator. He suggests that the reason we have no prophecy today is because the signal just isn't strong enough. He suggests that prophecy all comes through Moshe, and as we get further and further away from Moshe, the signal at some point just got lost. We couldn't pick up the signal anymore. So you find this attitude expressed in the Gemara that we're not as good as the previous generations. So I want to ask a fundamental question. I never heard this question asked when I was in yeshiva, but I want to ask it here tonight at Partners in Torah for the first time. I want to ask, is this approach too that I'm just describing, is that also an example of nostalgia, of improper nostalgia? Is the Gemara itself, kiviyachol, I asked this question seriously. Maybe this is the only form you can ask it. Is the Gemara guilty of a nostalgia towards the previous generations that it shouldn't be having? Torah seems to say that nostalgia distorts the way we look at the past. Is the Gemara guilty of the same thing, of looking at the past and the same thing? So I want to tell you, when I was young, I took offense at these Gemaras. Gemaras, and as I mentioned, there's more I haven't described for you tonight. I never really liked those Gemaras, because those Gemaras seemed to suggest that youth was guilty for being youth. It was like an indictment on behalf of my entire generation, so to speak. I took offense at those Gemaras because it seemed to suggest that we're just not as good as the previous generations, and no matter what we could do, or no matter how much we learned, no matter what we did, we just weren't going to be as good as the previous generations. So I never really liked that. It rankled me. I always thought of those skits. I remember hearing these Monty Python skits talking about, in my day, those Monty Python in my day skits. I remember he speaks there about, in my day, when I was a boy, I used to have to walk to school 6 miles in the mud and in the snow, and it was uphill both ways, right? It's classic Monty Python. So I would see Gemaras like that, and I would get that sort of feeling of, this is Monty Python over here, that everything was back in the good old days, and it disturbed me. But as I got older, ironically, I began to see it a little bit differently. And I began to see how refreshing that approach is. And now more than ever we see it, because so much of modern society, if you look around, so much of modern society seems to take the exact opposite approach. Society, it just seems to think that they're better than previous generations. There's no respect. There's very little respect for previous generations. You never hear respect for tradition, for past precedent. Judge Goldberg. Previous norms, the way things, common practice, established norms, it all goes out the window. And you very rarely hear people seem to think, you see people judging the past by the standards of today, and it never seems to enter anybody's mind that, one day the standards, in the future, tomorrow, the standards of today are going to be the standards of yesterday. You don't see that anymore. There's just no understanding that the past has something to teach us. It's like fashion, right? We all know that all fashion's coming back in, except the 70s. The 70s fashion is never coming back in, at least not for the men. I don't know about the women. But fashions come back into play, and the same thing with standards and practice. You just don't see that now. So that's what I mean to say. So that attitude, that suggesting about, if the past were like malachim, we're like human beings. If they're like human beings, we're like donkeys. I find that refreshing now, because what that means is there's a respect for the past. And I want to tell you something also. As you look further and one studies further, it's not so ironclad. Although it does seem to suggest, the way I read it to you, it seems to suggest this ironclad rule that the past is always better than the present. It's not true. There are several examples, just to name a few of them. There's a Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches us, this is a Mishnah in Idias, the Mishnah teaches us that one court, one beis din, is able to overturn the laws of a previous court, of a previous beis din, if that newer beis din is better than the older beis din, b'chachma u'b'minyan. If the newer court, the more recent court, is better in number and in age, it can overturn the previous beis din. Now there's some discussion as to what that means, because all Bati Din L'chorad should be comprised of the same number of judges. So there's some discussion as to what that means, but you see, at any rate, that that Mishnah presupposes the concept that courts can overturn the precedent of later courts. So it's not so ironclad. And there are other places as well. There are Gemaras that suggest that in more recent times we did know more, that newer generations do know more than the previous generations. So it's not so. What I'm trying to bring out with these examples is that it's not ironclad that the Gemara suggests that the past was always better than the present. Okay, the key is that it does it with respect. The Gemara respectfully allows the current generations to establish a foothold for itself, but it shows respect for the past. And there's a great phrase that I saw that really that sums out how it's done, and that phrase is "dwarfs on the shoulders of giants." That's a phrase which there's actually some academic literature about when that phrase first became popular. Turns out that phrase actually came about, it's 12th century. It's not even necessarily a Jewish phrase. It became popular by Isaac Newton later in the 16th century. But the phrase "dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants," that's a way that sort of puts both concepts together. A giant can see much further than a dwarf, but a dwarf standing on the shoulder of a giant can see even further than the giant itself. So I've seen that phrase used to explain that we don't necessarily consider ourselves as great as previous generations. They may have been greater than us. Maybe they were closer to Sinai. Maybe they were different. Maybe they were special. But we're still able to sometimes see a little bit further than them only by standing on their shoulders, dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. So I want to close. There's really one verse which I think sums up everything that we've been speaking about tonight. And that's a pasuk in Koheles. There is a pasuk in Koheles, Ecclesiasticus, I think is how it's pronounced. And that pasuk tells us, it's in Perek Zayin, pasuk Yud. The pasuk reads, Al toimer ma haya shehayamim harishonim haya tovim me'ele ki lo michachma she'alt al zeh. Don't say, why were the old days better than the good days? For it's not wise to ask such questions. Okay, once again, Al tomer ma hoya shehayamim harishonim haya tovim me'ele ki lo michachma she'alt al zeh. Don't say, how is it that the previous generations were better than now? For it's not wise to ask those types of questions. So look how this verse is deliberately vague, and I think you'll see this, as I mentioned, this sort of ties everything together. I've heard and seen people interpreting that pasuk in completely and diametrically different ways. Rashi, for example, Rashi not on the pasuk in Koheles, but in a different, in somewhere else in the Gemara. Rashi interprets that pasuk, and Rashi says that it means, don't ask, how is it that the previous generations were better than the current generations? Because it's obvious. They were much greater people. Rashi takes it for what we would call a davar pashut. Rashi considers it obvious that the previous generations were better than ours, and that's why the verse says, don't ask why they were better, because it's obvious. But others, the Ibn Ezra, read it exactly the opposite. They say, don't ask those types of questions because all the generations are the same, and it only appears to current generations that the previous generations were better than it was today. And it's only an illusion. It's not actually true. So you see, that's one verse which is vaguely worded, and it's written in a way that actually combines both meanings, and it's susceptible of both meanings, because I think that's precisely the point. It's that tug of war. There's forever a tug of war. And that's really what we have to, the takeaway that we're going to have to take away from here this evening. There's, whether it's in our secular life or whether it's in our engagement with Torah or with learning, there's a desire to cling to the past. That's nostalgia. As I said before in the beginning, it's very alluring. I'm no different than anybody else. There are many times when I want to look at things around me, and I want to feel as things were better in the past. And in some cosmic sense, perhaps maybe they were. And you want to lose yourself in the past. But the Torah tells us you can't. You can't do that. That's Eishes Lot. You can't allow yourself to get lost in the past. That's the generation in the Midbar. Zacharnu es hadaga. They remembered the fish when they were slaves. They remembered the fish, but it was distorted. So the Torah tells us you can't get lost in that nostalgia in the past. On the other hand, the Torah also tells us that we have to remember the past. We can't ignore it. We have to learn from it. Just like with Amalek, we are, in fact, not only should we do it, we're commanded. That's one of the 613 mitzvahs. We have to remember that past. We can't just ignore it. We have to visit it, not dwell in it. We have to visit the past because the past is what's going to enable us to write the future, which still hasn't been written. Also, on that same token, that's the same tug of war between how we evaluate the past vis-a-vis the present. On the one hand, you can look at the past and you can think that they were just better than they were today. There is that perspective that's out there, that they were just simply better than us. On the other hand, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily the case. You find that although we can venerate the past, and although we respect the past, we're not necessarily beholden to the past, despite our respect for them, because it's dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. Sometimes you can see past them. So this is obviously a difficult balance. It's not so easy how to walk that tightrope between these two viewpoints. But I wanted to share them with you this evening because, first of all, I think it's a topic that's not commonly explored. And second of all, I think it's also a topic that not everybody realizes that the Torah has what to say on it. But I think an honest assessment of the sources shows what I've tried to convey tonight, that really both perspectives are part and parcel of the Torah. The Torah does value the past, but at the same time, the Torah tells us we must go forward. And with that, I want to thank Rabbi Landis again, and I want to thank you all for listening.